There are discoveries in history that spark ordinary curiosity, and then there are those that provoke something far stranger, a brief, almost physical disorientation. You look at a rock, at a statue, at a block of stone, at a chamber carved into the earth, and for a few seconds, you get the impression that the scale has stopped being human. It is not even about beauty or age. It is about size, about something so vast that it ceases to look like the work of hands and begins to resemble the trace of an ambition that the modern mind can no longer intuitively read. And perhaps that is exactly why the greatest ancient discoveries still affect us so strongly today, because they are not simply old, they are too large, too heavy, too expansive, too consciously monumental, as if the past, instead of quietly receding into time, suddenly stepped in front of us and asked, "Do you really understand what we were capable of?" In this material, we will look at 7 ancient places and objects whose scale still provokes disbelief, not to fall into cheap sensation and not to replace archaeology with fantasy. Quite the opposite. The more honestly one looks at these places, the more unsettling they become, because science can explain a great deal: where the stone came from, what the tools look like, how cutting, transport, and stoneworking techniques developed. But even then, something remains that is hard to fully tame. Why did the ancient world so often think in dimensions that today seem almost inhuman? Why did so many cultures in different parts of the planet leave behind traces so enormous that the sight of them feels more like an experience than a piece of information? And what exactly does it say about ancient civilizations that their greatest works still seem too immense for the calm imagination to process? Let us begin with a place that looks as if someone tried to carve not a temple, but the very idea of power. Abu Simbel in southern Egypt. The 4 colossal seated figures of Ramesses II carved into the facade of the temple are each about 20 meters high. That already sounds absurd until you see photographs of people standing at the feet of those figures. Then scale stops being a number, it becomes a feeling. Ramesses was not meant simply to be represented here. He was meant to dominate the landscape. He was meant to sit on the edge of the empire like someone who not only rules the earth, but rises from it beyond ordinary measure. And that is not all, because the temple was designed so that sunlight would reach deep into the sanctuary at specific moments of the year. In other words, gigantism was combined here with a precise symbolic effect. Grandeur was not an accident, it was a program. And that is what is most unsettling about Abu Simbel. Not the size itself, but the cold awareness that this size was meant to work psychologically. It was meant to overwhelm. It was meant to change the human being before he even stepped inside. Today, we often look at ancient monumentality as exotic aesthetics, but for the people of the time, it was a tool, a religious, political, and emotional tool. When you stand before such a facade, you understand that architecture was not just construction, it was a technology of power. And that is exactly why the question of size becomes so important. Because if someone chooses 20-meter statues carved into rock instead of an ordinary temple, it means that magnitude was not an addition here, but a necessity. As if the ancient world understood something we no longer understand. That sometimes the greatest ideas must be written not in words, but in mass. Yet if Abu Simbel shows gigantism realized, the next example reveals something even more shocking. Gigantism that even antiquity itself could not complete. The Unfinished Obelisk in Aswan. When you look at it from above, at first it appears to be a gigantic crack in the bedrock. Only later does it register that this is not part of the hill, but an unfinished monolith. Had it been completed, it would have been over 40 meters long and would probably have weighed around 1,000 tons. The very intention is almost more staggering than many completed monuments, because here we are not dealing with something that simply survived. We are dealing with a project so enormous that even today its scale sounds like a challenge thrown at reason itself. We know that a fracture in the stone stopped the work, but that defect is precisely what makes the object so important. It lets us peer into the mind of an ancient civilization at the moment it was thinking, yes, that size is worth considering for us at all. That is extraordinarily significant. The unfinished obelisk tells us something finished monuments cannot. It shows the limit of ambition. It reveals to what level ancient Egypt was prepared to escalate scale before the material itself failed. And here appears a question more unsettling than all the theories about how they did it. Why did they want to make something that large in the first place? What makes a culture decide to separate from a single mass of stone an object heavier than many modern industrial machines? The answer cannot be trivial. This is not an ordinary decoration. It is not a practical utilitarian element. It is the record of a mentality in which magnitude is a value in itself, in which material is to be forced into obedience on an almost extreme scale. And perhaps that is why the unfinished obelisk acts today as something more than a monument, like the trace of a civilization that was not afraid to think in weights larger than the comfort of imagination. Even more brutally, Baalbek in modern-day Lebanon confronts us with the logic of scale. This place has long produced the same kind of stunned silence, not because of decoration, but because of the sheer mass of stone. In the foundations and quarries of Baalbek, there are blocks so immense that discussion of them instinctively shifts from history into almost mechanical disbelief. Blocks weighing hundreds of tons, and in the nearby quarry, even larger ones, unfinished, abandoned, as if they themselves were evidence that the ancient world was experimenting at the limit of transportable possibility. And again, the most extraordinary thing is not even that such stones exist. The most extraordinary thing is that someone considered them sensible, that someone sat down, calculated people, route, placement, height, pressure, friction, and decided, yes, this is the scale at which we will work. In Baalbek, size does not look like an aesthetic choice. It looks like an obsession, as if a smaller stone would have been too ordinary, too human, too easy. And it is precisely here that the true documentary dread begins, because when we look at hundreds of tons cut from a single mass, we begin to understand that ancient engineering was not only a matter of tools, it was also a matter of psychology, of what a culture considers worthy of effort. We often ask, how did they move such a block? But perhaps an equally important question is, why did they choose precisely such a block when they could have used smaller ones? The answer leads us to the very heart of this story. Size was a statement. It spoke of power, permanence, the ability to transcend the ordinary scale of man. In Baalbek, magnitude had to be so vast that it would stop looking like ordinary architecture altogether. If Baalbek works through weight, then the Serapeum at Saqqara works through enclosed space and something that seems almost incompatible with logistics. In the underground galleries, enormous granite sarcophagi were found, each weighing dozens of tons, while the lids themselves are massive monoliths. This is one of those places where scale does not attack from a distance like a temple or a statue. It sits in darkness, underground, inside corridors that already seem hostile enough on their own. And that is exactly why the effect is so strong. One does not merely ask where they found such gigantic granite boxes. One begins to ask how they were brought into such galleries at all and seated there with such certainty. This is not cheap sensation. It is an ordinary, almost claustrophobic feeling that the scale of these objects does not fit the intuition of the place in which they stand. The Serapeum has another quality that intensifies its atmosphere. It is not enough to see a huge block. You have to stand beside it, underground. Then the scale becomes almost physically disturbing. You have the impression that someone placed inside a sealed stone interior objects that belong more to the surface world or to the modern world of heavy transport. And yet, there they are, precisely made, with smooth surfaces, with a monumental calm that feels more like a verdict than an ornament. It is one of the best examples of the fact that antiquity did not only build great things. Sometimes it placed them in locations where their very presence becomes almost surreal. And it is precisely this contradiction, magnitude sealed within the dark, narrow world of underground galleries, that still denies people any peace when they think about the Serapeum. The next place takes us to India and shows us another dimension of gigantism, Kailasa at Ellora. This is not a structure assembled from blocks. It is a monolith carved out of solid rock from top to bottom, as if someone treated an entire hill as a block of material to be sculpted. The scale of the work is difficult to absorb. Enormous quantities of stone had to be removed without losing the integrity of the overall composition, the columns, passages, facades, and details. And that is exactly what makes Kailasa so extraordinary. Not only its size, but the kind of size it is. This is not mass transported from a quarry. It is mass removed from above, in such a way that a temple remained inside. It sounds almost like the reverse of ordinary construction. You do not assemble the world from elements. You remove the world until what you had in mind emerges. And it is precisely this inverted way of thinking that gives Kailasa an almost non-human aura. To create something like this, one must have a plan so clear that an error at any stage could ruin everything. You cannot simply add a new block and conceal a mistake. You have to know what will stand at the end before you remove the first fragment of stone. That requires not only labor, but engineering imagination on a colossal scale. And once again, the same question returns. Why did the ancient world so often chose solutions that were harder, riskier, more total than necessary? Why did it think this way at all? Perhaps because size was not an addition for these cultures. It was a way of convincing the human being that he stood before something greater than himself. One of the most underrated, and therefore especially powerful, examples are the Longyou Caves in China. These are enormous underground chambers, discovered only in modern times after water was pumped out of ponds that for a very long time looked completely unremarkable from the surface. But when their interiors were revealed, it turned out that beneath the earth lay vast, regularly cut spaces whose walls bore traces of deliberate workmanship. This is one of those moments in which archaeology becomes almost a narrative of dread, because what is discovered here is not a single object, but emptiness, vast, human-made emptiness carved in stone. Something so large and so effectively hidden that for centuries it could quietly lie beneath an ordinary landscape without betraying its scale. The Longyou Caves show that size can also work through absence, not only through a giant statue or a block, but through how much material was removed and how immense a space was created out of nothingness itself. That is particularly unsettling, because underground spaces always trigger a different kind of imagination than structures above the earth. They are more hidden, more ambiguous in function, more prone to generating questions that have no simple answers. Why create chambers on such a scale? How was the labor organized? Why was no clear record left of something so vast? The Longyou Caves may not be the most famous monument in the world, but perhaps that is exactly why they hit so hard. They look like a discovery that should not have been so enormous if it remained invisible for so long. And then we come to the most obvious example, and perhaps for that reason, the hardest to see freshly: the Great Pyramid of Giza. Too famous, too often shown, too heavily domesticated by popular culture. And yet, if one tries for a moment to cut away all postcard associations, pure shock returns. More than 2 million blocks, a monumental mass of stone raised with a precision that still provokes debate. Corridors, chambers, weight, geometry, orientation. The problem with the pyramid is that people have looked at it for so long as an icon that they have forgotten that it is an almost absurd object in the sheer scale of its design. This is not simply a large tomb. It is a programmed mountain created by human beings so that the body of one ruler and the idea of his divinity would be inscribed into the landscape for millennia. The Great Pyramid matters in this set, not because everything about it is unexplained. On the contrary, many elements of its construction can be described more and more clearly. But the better we understand the logistics, the organization of labor, the techniques of transport and stonework, the less the fundamental amazement disappears. Because explaining the process does not remove the question of the scale of intention. One still has to ask, why was such a gigantic undertaking chosen? Why did a culture decide that it was worth subordinating resources, people, time, and terrain to a single colossal form? And perhaps here lies the most important answer. The ancient world built magnitude not only to create something, it built it to alter man's relationship with time, so that power would not end with death, so that endurance itself would become politics. When we look at all these examples together, a pattern begins to emerge. Simbel shows gigantism as the theater of divine power. The Unfinished Obelisk shows ambition so great that even the stone could not endure the project. Baalbek reveals a cult of scale and the sheer weight of stone. The Serapeum shows greatness hidden in the darkness of the underground. Kailasa proves that an entire hill could be treated as sculptural material. The Longyou Caves show the immensity of created emptiness. The Great Pyramid reminds us that monumentality can be an attempt to write eternity into geometry. None of these are random exceptions. They are different versions of the same obsession. The obsession to build not only durable things, but things larger than ordinary human experience. And that is exactly why these discoveries are so hard to calmly explain. Not because science is helpless, but because even the best technical explanations do not remove the emotional core of the problem. What remains is still amazement that ancient societies wanted and were able to invest so much energy into scale that was not necessary for purely practical functioning. That means magnitude served a deeper function: symbolic, psychological, religious, political. It was a way of imposing meaning upon the world. And perhaps this is where the thin, real mysticism of antiquity lies. Not in theories about impossible technologies, but in the fact that human cultures have for a very long time carried within them the need to create something so large that the ordinary measure of man would cease to be enough. Today, we look at these places from a distance, from a drone's eye view, from a museum case, from a diagram in a book. But for the people who lived in the shadow of these objects, scale was not an abstraction, it was a daily experience of subordination. Imagine growing up beside the wall of a statue taller than many modern buildings. Imagine praying in a place where the stone weighs as much as hundreds of human lives. Imagine descending into a gallery where a granite sarcophagus awaits, heavier than anything your mind can fully contain. Then you understand that ancient gigantism was not only a display of strength toward other states, it was also an instrument directed toward one's own people. It was meant to build the sense that there exist things greater than the individual, greater than life, greater than time. And perhaps that is exactly why these finds so often generate exaggerated, uncertain, sometimes absurd theories around themselves. Because the human mind instinctively seeks an extraordinary cause for extraordinary size. If something seems too vast to fit calmly into known history, the temptation appears to assign to it a superhuman builder, a lost technology, or a forgotten civilization. Yet the truth is often more demanding. It was people, real people, with their states, religion, forced labor, engineering, imagination, and obsession with permanence. And perhaps that is the most uncomfortable thing of all. Not that someone built something impossible, but that human beings built it, and that for a long time we did not want to accept how radical human ambition could really be. So perhaps the most important question is not who built it, nor even how exactly was it built. Perhaps the most important question is, why did so many ancient cultures regard magnitude as a necessity? What did they understand about human psychology, religion, memory, and fear that made them so consistently leave behind works in which size itself becomes an argument? This leads us to a very simple conclusion, but one that is difficult to accept. History is not only the story of how small man slowly learned to make bigger things. History is also the story of how ancient civilizations understood very early that size in itself could be a form of power. And perhaps that is exactly why these discoveries still affect us. Because they are not dead, not in a psychological sense. They can still change our proportions. They still make the human being feel smaller than he would like to feel. They still impose silence. And silence before a monument is a very particular reaction. It means we have stopped looking only with the eyes of a tourist or a reader. We have begun to look like someone who has suddenly understood that the past was not small, primitive, or safe. It could be fast, deliberately fast, so fast that even today it cannot be spoken of entirely calmly. Because perhaps the greatest mystery of these 7 discoveries does not lie in how the stone was lifted, the chamber carved, or the monolith erected. Perhaps the greatest mystery lies in the fact that the ancient world so often aspired to a scale that looks more like a challenge thrown at time than ordinary architecture. And if that is true, then beneath the layers of ruins, dates, and weights, there is something else. Not the mystery of technology, but the mystery of the human need to leave behind something so vast that even after thousands of years later civilizations could not look at it with indifference. And perhaps that is exactly why, when we stand before such a place, we feel more than curiosity. We feel something heavier, as if the sheer magnitude of the past still refuses to let us walk away.